Prairie Yard and Garden is a production of the University of Minnesota Morris in cooperation with Pioneer Public Television. Funding for Prairie Yard and Garden is provided in part by Heartland Motor Company, providing service for over 30 years in the heart of truck country. Heartland Motor Company, we have your best interest at heart. Farmers Mutual Telephone Company and Federated Telephone Cooperative, proud to be powering ASERA. Mark and Margaret Yakel Julien, in honor of Shalom Hill Farm, a nonprofit rural education retreat center in a beautiful prairie setting near Windham in southwestern Minnesota. Shalom Hill Farm, shalomhill.org. Diamond Willow Advanced Care Assisted Living, providing custom homes with smaller settings designed especially for high care needs.
Last fall, my husband and I spoke to the South Dakota Master Gardeners at their convention in Sioux Falls. We had the best time and met lots of great plant people. They had several wonderful tours lined up, and one of them was to see the Japanese garden. Well, Tom and I did not get a chance to go on that tour, but we vowed to be back. And now we are inviting all our Prairie Yard and Garden viewers to come too. Let's go visit the Japanese garden in Sioux Falls. When Tom and I were in Sioux Falls, we had people tell us about the Japanese garden, the Chinese garden, and the Oriental garden, all referring to the same place. I'm Mary Holm, host of Prairie Yard and Garden, and I love a good mystery. Today we are visiting with Mary Ellen Connolly, who is going to tell us about this special garden and how it got its different names. Welcome, Mary Ellen.
Thank you, Mary.
Tell us a little about yourself and how you became involved with the Japanese garden.
Back in the late 70s and 80s, I became a consummate gardener. I joined the Minnesota Landscape Arboretum, and so we were exposed to these wonderful gardens out of state, and we always thought a wonderful garden in Sioux Falls, there should be one special place in Sioux Falls. There was a little article in the Argus Leader about how the city had appropriated some money to clean it up. It had kind of lay here in derelict condition for about 3 or 4 decades. So I contacted the people in the newspaper. I called a bunch of my friends. Some of them called their friends, and so we assembled this group of about 15 or 20 people that formed this nonprofit association to help the city bring this back to life.
So how did the Japanese garden originate? I mean, who started it?
Well, it was first the dream of this park caretaker, Joseph Maddox. In the 20s, I think he worked in here from 1918 for about 20 years, and it was his idea to build this garden. And at the time, it was post-World War, post-Depression, and they had the WPA workers, and they came in here and they built these terraces out of our indigenous stone, the quartzite, that was cut from the local quarries. He took a 2-year correspondence class in landscape architecture, and so this was his dream. And at the time, it was all the stone structures. He also collected a lot of special rocks from Wyoming and all around the state of South Dakota. So I sometimes consider this kind of, at the original way it was built was kind of grotto style.
What exactly is a Japanese garden?
So when people ask me that, I try to think of the simplest way to put it, because it's not that complex, but it's sort of taking the essence of the universe and synthesizing it into a smaller space. So there's a lot of symbolism in the garden. It's very important. Stones are very important because they represent mountains. The ocean is represented by our lake, and if we didn't have the lake, we would maybe provide another type of water feature. There's almost always a water feature in a garden. This particular garden is considered a strolling garden. So as you stroll, you imagine these different views come into view. You don't see the whole garden at once. It's also a focus on very natural and the very high aesthetics of Japanese art. I think of it as a combination of art and horticulture. Of course, then you have all the dynamics of the plants growing and changing, and you have to constantly work with that to keep things in scale. We have lanterns. There was, and these might be symbolic of the pagodas or the temples that they would have had maybe in the Japanese garden. The lanterns would be to light your way, and a lot of the times the Japanese garden was the center of the tea ceremony, which is a very sacred sharing of the tea, and that has a very strong ritual significance to that. So the lanterns would have lit the way to the tea ceremony. When the garden first began to be restored, the original people that worked in here were some of the inmates from the penitentiary, and they actually did a lot of tuck pointing at that time. But originally it was the WPA workers who built the walls. They said there was 150 workers in here at one time. So it was a massive project at one time.
What were some of the original plants that were selected to put in here?
I'm pretty sure we have a couple of the original plants. There's some mugo pines that are very large, beautiful old mugo pines on that end of the garden. But they used a lot of things that were commonly available, a lot of viburnum and spirea, pines. There were spruces used, but normally you wouldn't see a whole lot of spruces used in a Japanese garden at that time.
Well, you had mentioned restoration, so tell me about that history as to how it went from being built and being an important part of the culture in the city, and then kind of going downhill.
Yeah. So after the war, it pretty much lay in ruins for several decades until in the 70s there was an article that interviewed Mr. Maddox, and he was in his 80s at the time, and he was lamenting that the garden had not been repaired and restored, and he was hoping somebody would step up or the city would step up and begin that process. But it wasn't until the mid-80s when we saw this article in the paper about the city bringing this money in that our group got involved, and we formed this nonprofit. We called ourselves the Shoto Teien. And one of the people that was, one of the earliest people was Jim Bailey, and he had lived in Japan for a while as a child, so he was very interested in Japanese culture. And it was Jim and a couple other people, and then all of us, 15 or 18 other groups. We were artists, and they were gardeners, and they were architects and businessmen and local politicians. We had a whole bunch of people that just kind of came together with this united.
How did you even go about starting to restore?
So the city appropriated the first approximately $200,000 in the CIP, and the first stage of that then was getting the inmates in to grub it out and clean it up. And then at that time at the Minnesota Landscape Arboretum, they had just built a small Japanese garden in the Arboretum. And at the time they hired a gentleman, Dr. Koichi Kawana from the University of California system. We called him and he agreed to come. You can imagine that. And so he did our master plan. He came one time and placed the large boulders, which all the large boulders that are here, we gathered locally from farm fields around here. And they were all dropped at the north end of the garden. The plants that we used in the restoration, we tried to stick more with the traditional Japanese plants. Of course, we continue with the lilacs and the spireas, but there are several ginkgos in here. There's Japanese tree lilacs. Instead of cherry trees, we use crabapples and redbuds. We have hostas and quite a few low-growing but subtle perennials. Again, with the Japanese garden, you don't want anything to stand out and grab you. It's supposed to be the subtle, natural kind of microcosm of nature. But don't put loud, showy things in. And when you do have bloom, by the way, it's really there's a real big focus on seasons in Japanese gardens. So there's a focus on spring flowers with the lilacs and iris and things like that. In summer, again, in Japan, they would focus on probably iris. Of course, it's very important to have fall color, huge. And even the trees, then in winter, you want the pines, and then they're sometimes pruned in this way that they will hold snow. So it's a big thing to have this focus on seasons. We have mostly perennial ground covers, but the peonies are very important because that would be an important spring. And of course, peonies came from Asia, the Asian area. So
Then do you use quite a bit of mulch here in the garden area to help cut down on the weeding?
So that's the Parks Department. We have to really focus on them for a while because all through the year, it's the Parks Department that takes care of this place. It's part of the park system. You know, we're inside Terrace Park, and this is a historic park. It's on the National Historic Register. It's a 100-year-old park. And so all through the year, even we're not here and when Ben's not here, they're working consistently. So when they know that Ben's coming every year, they really get busy and get everything freshly mulched, which they would do anyway in the spring because just to make things look fresh, and they re-edge everything. You can tell they've done a really good job.
Then do you have to do fundraising then in order to help maintain the park?
So what we did when we did the restoration, we got the CIP money from the city, and then other people went out, and in fact Tom Daschle was our senator at the time, and he helped us get a Japanese cultural grant, and also the Toshiba from Mitchell grant for $100,000 each. So we had about a total of $400,000 that we spent at the time. So as we kind of finished up and everything was planted, the final things kind of got put together, the sidewalks, all those things, the couple new arbors, new wooden ones. Some of those were funded by grants from the DAR, and then we had about $30,000 left. And so instead of having it only collect interest in the bank, Pam put it with the Sioux Falls Area Community Foundation. And from that money then, we have to leave the original investment in there, but we just use the proceeds from that every year to bring Ben here. And we're going to talk about Ben Shu, who's been coming here now to help us maintain the garden and prune every year for 28 years. Wow. So from that fund at the foundation, we pay his expenses. We pay his airfare, his hotel room, and his services. And everything else we donate while he's here.
Is there anything special that is done here for fall maintenance or to overwinter the plants?
Mary, this pretty much can stand on its own, because so many of the deciduous trees are hardy here. We do have a harsh exposure here. We're on the north-facing direction, plus the cold winds from the north coming over the water. I'm kind of surprised sometimes how well things do. Even the redbuds and magnolias and some of the unusual, we have some unusual maples too that maybe could be a little bit borderline in hardiness, and they do really well. And otherwise for perennials, how they bounce back. They don't need much. They maybe they cut back the perennials and the grasses and things like the tall grasses and things like that. They don't mulch anything, they don't cover anything up.
Okay. Is the park and the garden used for special events?
There are dozens of weddings here every summer, of course. And Ben's event, when he comes every summer, that's a very special event. And this year it happened to be extra special because the Consul General from Japan, and that's the embassy that we got the money from back in the 80s, the grant, and he found out that, from our communication that Ben was going to come, and he coordinated a visit from Chicago yesterday all day just to be here when Ben was here.
Can you tell us a little about Ben, and do you think that he would walk us through the pruning of these beautiful plants?
Yes, absolutely. At the time that the garden was finished, the restoration kind of in the late 80s, Dr. Kawana unfortunately passed away, and we kind of were like without a rudder there for a while. And I knew that Dr. Kawana had also designed the Japanese garden at Missouri Botanic Garden. It's the largest Japanese garden in the country, in the United States. He also designed the Japanese garden at the Chicago Botanic Garden, at the Denver Botanic Garden, and 2 or 3 more significant ones, were probably more than that. And but I knew he had a relationship with this gentleman in St. Louis. I called down there and just said, who can I talk to? And it was Ben. We ended up talking to Ben, and he ended up coming up to Sioux Falls, and he's been coming ever since, so 28 years later.
Well, do you think we could watch him do some pruning and he could teach us?
He'll be, he's a master.
I have a question. Has the Arboretum introduced shade trees that are well adapted to Minnesota? Since the Arboretum started, that's been one of the objectives here, was to show all Minnesotans the diversity of trees that we can all plant in our yards. And of course, that's a good thing if we all plant different trees, so that if we have a problem like we all know what happened with Dutch elm disease and what's happening now with the emerald ash borer, if we're all planting a variety of trees, that'll prevent any one pest from making such an impact in one neighborhood or even in one person's yard. So the Arboretum has been bringing trees in from all over, but we've also introduced quite a few native trees. The tree I'm standing next to is Northwood red maple. This was discovered growing up in Floodwood, Minnesota, and this is the native red maple, Acer rubrum. A lot of people are confused with, they call the trees that are red all summer, real dark red, that are either a Crimson King Norway maple or a Royal Red Norway maple or a Schwedler Norway maple. They call those red maple, but this is the true red maple that's native throughout much of Minnesota and is known for having being just a real nice shade tree. During the summer they have beautiful green foliage. They generally have a nice pyramidal shape, and Northwood is a good example of having a really nice shape. It doesn't have really any real serious pest problems, and it's a really good tree. One drawback would be is if you have an alkaline pH, but the Arboretum has introduced a number of other trees as well. There's the Autumn Splendor Buckeye, which is a hybrid buckeye, and the leaves hang on 3 to 4 weeks longer and develop a very nice red fall color. And also very interesting palmately lobed leaves, so kind of unusual tree that some of your neighbors probably don't have. And those are just two examples. It's really a good idea to come to the Arboretum, go to the horticulture garden at the West Central Research and Outreach Center, talk to your local nursery, and it's a big decision to plant a tree. And make sure you're selecting one that's well adapted for where you live and that has all the different seasons. All the U of M selections have a nice summer form, attractive fall color, and then winter interest. So think about the full year in your landscape when you're selecting a tree.
Ask the Arboretum Experts has been brought to you by the Minnesota Landscape Arboretum in Chanhassen, dedicated to enriching lives through the appreciation and knowledge of plants.
Ben, I have heard that you're a wonderful pruner. And what time of the year is the best time to be doing the pruning?
Usually ends up being around late spring to the early summer.
Why is that the best time?
That's when the candles, the new growth on the pine trees are beginning to elongate. This is what we call a candle, and that's beginning to elongate, and the needles are starting to develop. So that's usually the best time to prune.
So when you do the pruning, what kind of tools do you use?
Usually this is the main tool that I'll use is a hand pruner, so bypass type hand pruner where the blade bypasses this anvil, so it cuts like a scissor. And occasionally if there's a branch too large for my hand pruner, then I'll use a handsaw. I have a folding handsaw that I'll carry with me to do any large cuts, but typically it's just all done with a hand pruner.
That takes a long time to do one plant then, doesn't it?
It does. It does take quite a while, and depending on the size of the plant and how dense it is and how well it's grown, it could probably take you, in some instances, an entire day to do a tree. It'd take you hours to prune one tree.
How do you know how much to take off?
Well, there's usually a typical rule of thumb that you don't want to ever take off more than a third of the mass when you're pruning a tree. But in some instances, you may end up taking off a little bit more. You may take off a little less, and it really is dependent upon how vigorous you have, how vigorous the tree is. If it's less than vigorous, you'll take off a little bit less. If it's really vigorous, then you know that the tree is in fairly good health and condition, and you could probably take out a little bit more.
How do you shape a tree like this?
A lot of the way we shape the tree is number one, dependent on what the inherent shape of the tree is, what it's already growing with and its character. And it's our job to bring out that character through our pruning. Normally when we're pruning a tree, we'll usually start at the top of the tree and work down the structure, working each individual branch. And as we're pruning the top, we are most often not removing the central candle, the new growth coming out. We'll prune it off, like this piece here. We'll prune out this central candle, leaving these other smaller ones around it. If it's real dense, we'll thin those out a little bit. Well, by taking off maybe 1 to 2 or 3 candles instead of the multiple that are existing. Then after we've pruned that, then we'll work down to the interior of the branch to the trunk, pruning each individual branch so that as we're pruning back, those branches are getting gradually longer. So there's a taper from the end all the way back into the trunk.
Why do you take the middle one down so much farther than the others?
That helps to limit the growth. Since we have a limited area to grow within, we have to be sure that we are maintaining the trees at an appropriate size, and you want to keep it in proportion to the overall landscape. Given that this area of the garden is very narrow, you want to be able to keep the trees relatively short so that people, as they're viewing them, don't have to look, they don't have to lean back really far to view the top of them. So as you're walking along the sidewalk, you can just take a natural gaze into the landscape and be able to see the tree in its entirety.
Why do you start at the top and work your way down?
If you start on the side and you remove too much, by the time you get to the top, in order to balance the tree out, you'd have to take out considerably more, and eventually, and you could potentially cut a hole into the top of the tree by starting on the side. So you always want to start at the top and establish a point of reference and move down the side of the tree.
Do you do all of the trees here in the Japanese garden, or do you get help with this?
Well, we get help to prune, to help hold them in place is basically what volunteers are doing. They're pruning candles, the central candle out, which helps to slow the growth, maintain size until such point that we have more time to shape them and prune them more open, like this tree here or the trees that are around this one. But everything else, the finer, larger trees, I'll do all the pruning. I'll usually just prune until I complete the tree, and then I'll stand back and look at it, and then that'll be the time where I'll judge if there's an area that might be a little bit too dense, or maybe there's a piece that is outside the form that I'd hoped to establish. Typically, I don't spend a lot of time assessing the tree until I'm finished with it.
Is pruning a one-time-a-year job?
In this garden, yes. In the garden in St. Louis, yes, it's once a year. In other gardens, they will prune twice a year. They'll prune their Japanese pines twice. First pruning is they'll take out the central candle that slows the growth and keeps it from growing out anymore. And then in the fall, they'll come back and thin it out. So that the theory is that by pruning out the central candle, you can hold the growth, growth back, but at the same time you have the additional smaller buds developing and growing that will photosynthesize and add nutrients and feed the tree.
Ben, why is it important to be careful as to how far back you go? Because sometimes people don't know that. Could you explain that, please?
On these types of trees, this is what's called a whorl type conifer, and often if you cut too far back in or you cut back to an indiscriminate point along the stem, you will not get regrowth. So you have to be careful that when you're pruning that, you'll either prune to another whorl. So for instance, if you were to prune this branch, you'd have to prune to this branch right here. You'd have to prune to another whorl of branches. You'd have to prune to a bud like this, or you would have to prune just a new growth to allow new buds to develop at the base. But the further you go back onto the branch and into the older wood, the less likely it will be to have a new bud develop.
So it may not ever send out new growth after that if you go back too far.
That's correct.
How about on plants like, I know that there's some spirea here. I think that's kind of a different type of a thing. When can you prune that, or do you prune those now too?
You could prune those now. It's probably, if it's an early spring flowering one, you would prune it right after it flowered. And that would encourage it to put out new growth and also to develop new buds for next year.
Do you have to worry about that as much as on this, as going back too far and not having it send up new shoots again?
Not on spirea. If you do it at the wrong time of the year, it would be a concern. If you do it, like if you waited to do it into the summer, that would be the wrong time to do it, and you might not get regrowth. You'd want to do heavy pruning on plants in early spring as they begin to go into a cycle of growth. Once they go into a cycle of growth and you prune them aggressively, they will recover. If you wait until that cycle of growth is ended and the cycle has shifted to another function, you're not going to get regrowth of tissue of leaves during that mid-cycle, like as you go into summer.
I was told that you actually even taught a class on pruning while you've been here. Is that right?
I have. I did a class last night about 4:30 and gave a little bit of instruction on what it takes to prune the tree and what is the philosophy and what's the rationale for pruning the way that we do.
Well, and I'm sure that the volunteers here that we're helping really learned a lot and probably have done a pretty good job of helping with pruning some of the things too, and watching you and working under your guidance maybe is the right word to say.
Well, they've done a good job with we've been working together for a long time, and their main focus is just to kind of cut the candles back and hold the growth back, and occasionally if they feel like they want to do a little bit of pruning and shaping, then they'll do that as well. But I think that you have to be courageous, and make the cut, so.
Well, I think some of them are master gardeners too, and so they probably know quite a bit about starting to do that too.
Sure.
That helps.
Sure.
Thank you so much
You're
for
welcome.
being willing to show us how you do this and why you do it too. That really is great for our viewers.
Well, I appreciate you asking me questions. Appreciate sharing the information.
Funding for Prairie Yard and Garden is provided in part by Heartland Motor Company, providing service for over 30 years in the heart of truck country. Heartland Motor Company, we have your best interest at heart. Farmers Mutual Telephone Company and Federated Telephone Cooperative, proud to be powering ASERA. Mark and Margaret Yakel Julien, in honor of Shalom Hill Farm, a nonprofit rural education retreat center in a beautiful prairie setting near Windham in southwestern Minnesota. Shalom Hill Farm, shalomhill.org. Diamond Willow Advanced Care Assisted Living, providing custom homes with smaller settings designed especially for high care needs.